Omen13 is a name that you may have heard before when it comes to the world of underground rap, whether it's through his association to people like Lil Peep, Craig Zen, Schema Posse, or even Xavier Wolf. Yeah, that's right, Omen13 has actually been around some of the most prolific members of the underground during the time that he's been making music, but there's a lot more to him than that, because he's also a talented producer, rapper, and just all around good performer. And some might even call him a legend within the scene, so you know the drill at this point. I want to look into his story, his life, how he got to where he is now, and where he's going to go in the future. So let's talk about it all when we look into the story of Omen13. Troy Thomas was born February 17, 1995 in Cleveland, Ohio, but his time there was pretty short spent, moving to California at only the age of 2. And this is because his birth mother wasn't able to take care of him after his father ended up walking out on them. She was left to take care of 4 children, and without enough money to make ends meet, she had to make the heartbreaking decision of giving him up to her brother and his wife. But it actually wasn't even Omen's mother who made that decision, it was actually his grandmother who did it behind his mother's back, and because of that, their relationship would become very strained as the years went on. But even though his childhood got off to kind of a rough start, it doesn't mean it was all bad, because his uncle and aunt actually ended up becoming pretty good parents to him, often bringing him to a karaoke bar where he would get up on stage and sing for everybody in the audience. And this would give him a love for music at a very early age, with him actually wanting to learn how to play guitar at the age of 8 because he would watch a cartoon called Dexter's Lab where there was a character named Valheim who always played guitar and he really wanted to be like him. Or actually, I think his name was Valhallen. I don't know, people who watch the show can tell me for sure, but this is the character right here.
Valhallen? You're on.
He would teach himself how to play electric guitar, with him actually bringing his amp and guitar to school so he could perform different deathcore songs that he would teach himself in his spare time. And lucky for him, unlike other places in America, his area was actually very heavily invested in the deathcore genre because of a band known as Suicide Silence, which actually went to the very same high school that he did a couple years before he got there. And this would eventually lead him to try to start up his own band, but he was never able to find a vocalist, so unfortunately it fell apart. Just like basically every other emo rapper or trap metal artist I've talked about in these videos, they try to start a band, it doesn't work out, and then they become a solo artist. And around the same time, he would start to become kind of resentful to his adopted parents. It wasn't that he didn't love them, but he realized over time that his last name was different than theirs, and then he would piece it together as he got older, and by the time that he was in middle school, he realized that they weren't actually his birth parents. And this would lead him to start seeking out father figures, with his gym teacher being one of them, eventually convincing him to join the volleyball team, even though he had absolutely no interest in that whatsoever. But it actually worked out for him because after high school, he was able to get a job as a volleyball coach, which he ended up doing alongside his 2 other jobs at a pizza place and an Amazon warehouse. And after high school, he ended up just kind of bouncing around, not really feeling like he had anywhere in the world to be, and that nothing was really motivating him to be better, but at the same time, he was surviving, and that's all that really mattered. His family would then try to convince him to go to college to pursue a degree, which he didn't really have any interest in whatsoever, but seeing as how he was already out of high school and was working 3 jobs, he thought, well, this is probably the next logical step for what I need to do in life, which honestly happens to a lot of kids around that age. But luckily for him, when he discovered SoundCloud with the track 9K Freestyle by Chris Travis, everything would change for him. Yes, that's right, he would also fall down that same rabbit hole of Sesh Hollow Water Boys like every other rapper that I've talked about, Kamiyata, Lil Lotus. Bones really did inspire like half of the SoundCloud wave. It's crazy how influential he actually is, but Omen was in love with it. But unlike Kamiyata, who was more inspired by the collective aspect of things, Omen was more intrigued by the fact that they were doing everything by themselves without the need of a label or big time record companies putting money into them. They were making music in their backyards, shooting their own videos, producing their own songs, and this opened his eyes to a whole new way of releasing music, with him not having to have a band to back him up or anything like that. He'd be able to just put songs out on SoundCloud and then release them to the world for everybody to listen to. This would inspire him to get back into music around 2014, as well as attending a lot of the early Sesh Hollow Waterboy shows that were thrown in warehouses, getting to know artists like Black Smurf, as well as Dylan Ross and Drip 133, with Omen actually going on to lease a couple of Drip's beats to make some of his earliest music. He would also begin to produce his own beats under the name Dreamwalker, before then switching his name over to Omen13, meant to represent 2 things that were seen negatively in American culture, being Omen and 13, with Omen often meaning that something would be negative, but there could also be an omen of good things to come, as well as 13 being an unlucky number in Western culture, but in some cultures it's actually seen as a sign of good luck. So his name basically means to look at something from a different perspective. It could be negative or positive, but it really comes down to you to decide which one you think it is. After he finally decided on what type of name that he wanted to go with, he ended up dropping dropping 7 small EPs throughout the year 2015, gaining a small fan base as well as getting the attention of a couple artists, including one known as Trap Goose. But most of you know him as Lil Peep. Yeah, that's right, Lil Peep actually discovered Omen 13 before basically anybody else. I think Bexy might have been in the picture at the time,
Fire burning, so they wanna try be cool with me.
but those two were friends probably the longest out of anybody. And after talking back and forth a little bit in SoundCloud DMs, they decided to make a tape together called In the Bedroom I Confess, as well as 2 more tracks called Never Alone and Family. And this all happened when Peep was living in New York, but he would eventually move out to California and meet Omen in real life for the first time. And at this point, Peep and Omen were really only trying to hang out as buddies. They weren't really trying to be the biggest artist in the world, but things would get more complicated once more people got introduced and Peep would start to join Schema Posse and get in with the wrong guys. But at least for now, things were simple, well, at least relatively speaking, because Omen would start to get nosebleeds from stress working his 2 jobs, so he decided to step away from both of them and try to pursue music as a full-time career. His first connection was Peep, who got him in with some of the Schema boys, eventually meeting Craig Zen, who would actually invite him to move into the Pasadena house where most of the early SoundCloud wave was living at the time. Yeah, if you didn't know, Craig Zen used to be with Schema Posse before he was ever with members only. It's kind of weird how he connected to everybody at once, but he becomes very important to the story a little bit later on. Once 2016 kicked off, Omen ended up dropping his next project called Half-Hearted, as well as doing small-time shows in the area, getting to meet more Schema members like Cold Blooded and Jay Green. And he even managed to land a couple music videos on the channel known as Trill Funk, but unfortunately, as you already know, within this scene, there was a lot of drug use and drama, so before he even got a chance to join Schema Posse, Craig Zen was already on the way out, taking his connection from them away. But even with that opportunity off of the table, he was able to join a new collective that Craig Zen formed up with him and Killstation called Infinite Militia, so it wasn't like he was completely out of the music scene after that connection was burnt. And speaking of burnt bridges, Omen would also appear on a track called As the Bridge Burns, which had a feature from the Suicide Boys on it, and Lil Peep was actually supposed to have a verse on it as well, but Craig Zen would cut it just out of pure pettiness, so you could see there was a little bit of friction forming up between the 2 members. But even with Craig and Peep continuing to fight with each other, Omen and Cold Blooded's connection would grow deeper and deeper, with them starting to work on a joint EP called Minus 13 Degrees, as well as everybody living in the house at the time, as well as people who were visiting, getting on the legendary track known as Homecoming, which was unfortunately deleted after Peep departed from Schema Posse, but either way, it basically was the one time that everybody was connected, all making music together with multiple features on one song. And if you're wondering why Lil Peep ended up leaving Schema Posse, it's basically because he was the biggest draw out of the whole group when it came to live performances, but yet he was getting the smallest percentage, so he decided to push back on Jay Green and ask for a bigger percentage, with Jay Green saying he was going Hollywood, asking for too much money, and thinking that he was a bigger star than he actually was, and after that, they ended up falling out. Immediately after that, Peep ended up going on a tour with Fat Nick and Smoke Perp, thinking everything was cool, but Jay Green was actually really upset about the situation. I could go into more detail, but I already talked about most of that in the Cold Blooded video, so if you want to check that out, you can get more details on that fallout, but right now, let's get back to Omen. He ended up going on his own tour across Texas with Wavy Jones, Nedarb, and Ghostmane, and then after that, he ended up moving into the Witter house with Peep, Craig Zen, and basically everybody else that was living in the Pasadena house beforehand. During the time that he was living there, he was able to drop several projects, including one called Into the Depths, which had a feature from Gizmo and Nedarb, as well as getting a music video and a story, which was a pretty big deal for him. But even though everything was going well musically, his actual home life was chaos in the Pasadena house, with people fighting with each other. Craig Zen would get mad at Pete, Pete would get mad at Ghostmane. It was just pure chaos, and at the same time, unfortunately, one of Omen's friends would pass away from an overdose, leaving him in a really bad mental space. I feel like when it comes to this part of the SoundCloud wave, a lot of people really like to blow the fights that people had out of proportion. You gotta think, this was a bunch of people in their young 20s, making money off of music for the first time in their life, doing a bunch of drugs, getting bigger and bigger egos, and eventually labels would get involved, so there was petty fights all over the place, but really none of them were that big of a deal. But the one thing that was kind of a big deal is the fact that Craig Zen would actually turn the power off at the house when Omen was still living there, so that definitely wasn't a great situation, but it wouldn't stop him from dropping non-stop projects throughout the next couple years. When it comes to Omen, it was definitely a slow burn for him to blow up. I mean, he was already a pretty big artist at this point, doing big time shows across the country, but there was never that one hit that just blew him up into the stratosphere. He just did features with the right people at the right time, dropped non-stop music, kept his fans happy, and got bigger and bigger as time went on. Which is basically how everybody used to do it back in 2015 and 2016. It wasn't until 2017 when you started to get people like Lil Pump who would just blow up into the mainstream overnight with one song, not being able to handle it because they had never had that type of fame or power before, and they completely squandered it because of it. Eventually, you would start to get booked on shows with people like Ramirez, Black Smurf, and even Jay Green. With the two of them getting booked at so many venues together, they actually had plans to go on a full-on tour. This was known as the Doubt Me Now tour, and they ended up covering both the west and east side of the country, being the biggest tour they ever went on before. So at that point, it must have felt like they finally were living out their dreams, being able to see fans in every state around the country country, it had to be a good feeling, but unfortunately at the end of 2017, tragedy would strike once again. Because on November 15th, 2017, both Lil Peep and his mother would pass away the very same day, putting him in a dark spot, but at the same time, he felt like he had finally found some form of peace with the whole being adopted in his early life. But I definitely don't want to speak for him, so I would say that if you want to hear his true thoughts about that day, I would check him out on the Mascarilla podcast where he speaks about it, because of course I'm never going to be able to articulate the true emotions that he was feeling during that time, so go check that out if you haven't, but for now, let's move on. In 2018, he ended up dropping 3 projects throughout the year, as well as going on a tour across China called the Freak Show Tour, with one song in particular blowing up over there called Black Sheep. I'm not sure exactly how it works, but there's basically an app in China called WeChat, which is a combination of Instagram, Skip the Dishes, Spotify. Basically every app you have on your phone is all within this one app, and his song ended up blowing up on there, so he got a lot of fans in China and was able to tour there frequently. But even with his new growing fan base in China, this tour was a complete disaster, with a last minute budget cut, meaning that Cold Blooded couldn't come along, as well as most of his usual guys that he would perform alongside of, meaning that he was basically only going with the skeleton crew, and because of that, it wasn't the best tour. And if that wasn't bad enough, as soon as he got back, he ended up getting into a motorcycle accident, really badly hurting his body, meaning he couldn't perform or tour the way that he wanted to for the next couple years. But even with all this misfortune going on in his life, he wouldn't stop making music, and he actually ended up forming up a new collective known as Red Star, and they all lived together in a place called the Red Star House, where they would often throw performances in the backyard. Now, seeing as how he just built a stage in his backyard, you would think these shows would be pretty small time, but it turns out there was a lot of fans in the local area that would come out almost every night to watch them all perform. It was a really cool experience that went on throughout most of 2019, but in 2020, we all know what happened. And this could not have been a worse time for the pandemic to break out, because Xavier Wolf and Omenxiii were actually set to go on tour together around this time, but as we know, once 2020 happened, if you tried to do a show, you were seen as somebody who was trying to put people in danger, so they weren't able to do it, and they ended up sitting home throughout the year just making music. He ended up dropping 3 projects throughout 2020, as well as signing a low-key record deal, which some people saw as him selling out, but at the same time, he wasn't able to do shows and make his usual income that way, so signing a deal was definitely a smart move, because people were really trying to act like he signed a big 360 deal that would blow him up into the stratosphere, but it really wasn't like that. It was basically just a deal where he would do ghost production for other artists, so are you really going to be that mad at it? I mean, I guess you can be, but for me, I don't really care. At this point, another weird event would take place when Omenxiii ended up beefing with an artist known as Lil Dusty G, which if you don't know who that is basically somebody who was trying to steal Peep's look, his cadence, and even actually taking his lyrics bar for bar, as well as taking a couple of Omen's lyrics and putting them in his own songs. At first, it really wasn't that big of a deal because the song was only on SoundCloud, meaning not too many people were going to see it. Omen would comment on the track basically saying, "Don't drop this anywhere else," but of course Lil Dusty G wouldn't listen, doing a full-on music video on Elevator with high production value, which really pissed off Omenxiii, leading him to do an interview where he would call him out. And on top of that, a YouTuber known as Progress would notice what Lil Dusty G was up to, making a video where he basically exposed the fact that he was stealing lyrics, stealing his style, and stealing basically everything, trying to make a rap persona out of it, so he pretty well got cancelled at that point, and the beef never really went a whole lot farther. And after that, for the next couple years, Omen basically moved into the background, working with his label to make beats for other artists, and not really speaking publicly on a whole bunch of stuff, because as we all know at this point, basically anybody who was around Peep in any capacity got a lot of online harassment, whether it's people asking for songs, or just asking questions, or just telling them that they should have been there on that day. It's bad enough that you have to lose somebody in the first place, but losing somebody in the public eye definitely makes it a lot worse, so you can see why Omen became the way that he did. And on top of that, he would have a bit of a fallout with Jay Green, basically because he always had Cold Blooded over at his house. Jay Green thought that he was trying to take him away from Schema Posse, even though Schema Posse wasn't really formed up at the time, but either way he was pissed about that. And on top of that, after Omen ended up hurting himself in the motorcycle accident, Jay Green was pretty pissed off that he wouldn't do shows with him anymore, even though of course he was injured. There was no way he was going to be able to get out to those shows, and everything would finally come to a head when Omen ended up going to a show that Cold Blooded was playing at, and he would tweet out that he was only there to see Cold Blooded and not to see Jay Green, and after that they ended up having a fallout. They've never been cool again, but I don't think there's really beef where they're going to kill each other on site or anything like that. Also keep in mind, I've never talked to Jay Green personally, so I don't know what he was thinking or feeling at the time that this beef was going on, so don't take this as me trying to take sides in the situation. I'm just trying to archive and talk about it, so if Jay Green ever wants to say something that contradicts any of these points, I'd definitely be up to hear it. I'm really not trying to insert myself into beef between two rappers. I just want to archive and talk about this type of stuff, so if I get anything wrong, definitely let me know in the comments below. Just try to make it constructive, because some people just say everything's wrong, and I can't really do anything with that information, because what's wrong? How can I fix it? If you say everything's wrong, then I'm just going to ignore the comment, you know? And with all that said, we're pretty well caught up to modern day, where Omenxiii has just left his record deal. He's thinking of dropping some independent music pretty soon, which I think a lot of fans are looking forward to, and even though he never really made it to the big time and became a huge rapper like Lil Peep or XXXTentacion, he's definitely still known within in the underground. And it's pretty cool to see, even with everything that happened in his life, he kept working, kept making music, and he kept showing his fans that he cared about them time and time again. I mean, the guy actually severely injured himself in a motorcycle accident and still showed up for his fans and performed for them, so I have to give it to him. He actually gives a shit about music. It seems like he has a real passion for music, and because of that, he kept making what he loved, kept doing shows, and never really sold out for a bag, so I gotta shout him out for that. But don't harass him about this video, don't try to ask him questions. I feel like the guy just wants to be left alone. You can definitely tell in his more recent interviews that the world is weighing heavy upon him, so I don't want to give him any more strife or cause any more problems. Don't hit him up asking a bunch of stuff about Peep and saying that you came from me. Just leave the dude alone. But yeah, shout out to him, shout out to you, shout out to Knife Gang, shout out to that subscribe button that you should definitely hit, because I'm trying to get to 15k and I would really appreciate if you could hit that. But if not, well, I appreciate you for watching anyways. And with all that said, see you in the next one. Might do it on Wavy Jones, don't really know. Maybe we'll get Lil Bo Weep, not really sure which one we're gonna do, but one of them is coming in the very near future. So appreciate you guys for sticking around, and let me know who you want to see next as well.